Kevin Rudd, good evening. How would you characterise the US and China relationship right now?
Well, it's probably the worst I've seen it in the 35 years or so since I've been either a student of the US-China relationship or been involved in it in one way or another, either as a diplomat or later, of course, in life as foreign minister and prime minister. It's brittle, it's rocky, and it is entering into a brand new phase. And we can pin that down to the developments of the last 12 months.
When you say the past 12 months, what in that time has happened specifically to have worsened this relationship?
Well, on the United States side, it really begins formally with the new US National Security Strategy of December 2017. That's where you see the first formal definition by the United States of the end of a 40-year period of strategic engagement between China and the United States, and what they proclaimed then to be the beginning of a new period of formal strategic competition with China. Since then, we've had the new National Defense Strategy of January this year, a new National Defense Manufacturing Strategy. Of course, we've seen several statements now by Vice President Pence characterizing the new relationship with China in more adversarial terms. And of course, then there, of course, is the trade war, which is unfolding. But these represent a fundamental structural shift in the US strategic perception of China. And I think, Stan, for the audience in Australia, it's important to understand that this shift seems to have support across the aisle in American politics. Democrats are not objecting to it. The business community seems to be behind it. The major departments of state, Pentagon, the State Department and Commerce, the intelligence community seem to be rock solid as well. This is a big change.
To what extent has China helped to create this? Of course, we've seen greater assertiveness in the South China Sea, China's economic and financial expansion, its creeping influence in the region, particularly in the Pacific. Some of this may be interpreted by the United States as pushback against America's presence in the region.
Well, Sam, my experience with international relations, it always takes two to tango. So there are certain Chinese actions which have certainly moved beyond the status quo, and then there are certain US reactions to that. If you take the Chinese actions which have moved beyond the status quo, Xi Jinping, since he became president 6 years ago, has made very clear that he doesn't intend to remain on the, as it were, the passive end of the diplomatic equation globally. He's formally abandoned Deng Xiaoping's strategy of hide your strength, bide your time, never take the lead, which basically governed Chinese diplomacy for 30 or 40 years, and instead has formally directed the Chinese foreign and security policy establishment to embrace a new period of Chinese foreign policy activism. So we've seen the Belt and Road Initiative, that's one. You've seen in the high technology stakes, China announced in 2015 the new China Made in China 2025 strategy, which says in unambiguous terms that the Chinese intend, if they can, to dominate the high technology trade of the future. And then finally, of course, they're the land reclamations in the South China Sea. And meanwhile, on the American side, President Trump, with his own homegrown brand of, shall I say, America First, of a new assertive American view in terms of trade and strategy in the world, clearly identifying China now as an external adversary, hence the change in language, hence the change in posture.
Mr. Rudd, sometimes we can talk ourselves into war. What is the concern that you have that this intense competition between America and China could easily escalate into something much more dangerous?
Well, I don't think it's in the interests of either China or the United States, as they see it themselves, to get into the business of a shooting match. From the Chinese side, the strategic interest is pretty clear. They fear that they would lose it. And from the American side, there is no appetite for the level of losses that the United States would suffer in any conventional conflict with the People's Republic of China. So I don't believe there's any intention on either side that these two countries should head towards an armed conflict. But the real problem, Stan, is that the deterioration of the bilateral relationship generally means that it's a now much more brittle relationship than it ever used to be. The buffers have basically been dismantled, provided in the past by at least the business community in both countries, and the broader economic relationship, well, that's been ripped out as well. So that if now we end up with an incident, for example, two ships colliding in the South China Sea, two aircraft colliding somewhere in the same region, or future, shall I say, misperceptions if things start to fall off the tracks as far as the North Korean nuclear negotiations are concerned, that an incident occurs, and the political relationship being so brittle and so basically tinder dry that the possibility of escalation from that single incident is much greater than it was before. That's basically what we ended up with the shooting match in 1914 about, which was no one planned on it. It just became very poor incident management.
Is Australia in the crosshairs of this? How does Australia manage these tensions?
Well, often back in Oz, we tend to assume that we're unique in this business. Frankly, the rest of the world is now dealing with the dynamics of this structural deterioration in the US-China relationship. It's a factor in Japan, it's a factor in South Korea, it's a factor throughout Southeast Asia. I was recently in Singapore and in Indonesia and in the Philippines, and so it is in Australia. The Europeans feel this in a different way as well, and that is when you have this basically audible ripping of the political texture of the relationship apart and its strategic underpinnings being dismantled, while at the same time China being the significant economic partner of most of the Asian hemisphere, including Australia. So obviously these are difficult tensions to negotiate. I think we in Australia, though, are smart enough to still be able to do that.
When you say smart enough to do it, what's your assessment of the way that Prime Minister Scott Morrison has handled it thus far?
Well, I'd make two comments about the current Australian government's strategy towards China. In the last several years under Prime Minister Turnbull, I think we just saw flip, flop, flap from super soft to super hard to rising damp. There's been no consistent China strategy throughout the years of the Turnbull government. With Prime Minister Morrison, I'd make this comment that with the new focus on the South Pacific, Australia, under this Conservative government, now 5 years plus old, has really dropped the ball fundamentally on the South Pacific, purely on the question of the delivery of sustained long-term investment through our development assistance program. When I was Foreign Minister back in 2011, we were running a development assistance program across the South Pacific of about $1.2 billion a year plus. By 2016, that had collapsed to $800 million, and maybe by 2018-19, it might be back to the levels I left it at as Foreign Minister back in 2011. Now, when you start to create a strategic vacuum, particularly on infrastructure questions in the South Pacific, is it any surprise that other countries start to walk in? And that's what China has done. So on that question, given the role that Morrison has had as Treasurer and now as Prime Minister, I really scratch my head about the failure of strategic logic and what the government has done by so denuding the development assistance budget over the last 5 years, particularly in the South Pacific.
How closely is China watching Australia? And just wondering which line that we take here. Of course, there is Australia's close relationship with the United States. There is the military cooperation in the region, the shared naval base with the US on Manus Island. How much of this is China looking at and thinking, well, which way will Australia jump here? And what are the potential consequences?
Well, I think the first thing to say is that China at present, going back to your first question, Stan, about the state of the relationship with Washington, has as its number one preoccupation the future of this US-China relationship. And the trade war within itself has a fundamental capacity to undermine Chinese economic growth looking into 2019 and beyond if it really goes wrong. Already there's been an impact on Chinese domestic business sentiment over the trade war. The reason I say that is, as China contemplates a fundamental, as it were, strategic worsening in its relationship with Washington, what I also notice is that it's doing everything it can simultaneously to improve its relationships with Japan and with India. Recent visits by Abe to Beijing have been all about expanded economic cooperation, even security dialogue, even soft participation in the Belt and Road Initiative. With India, when Xi Jinping saw Modi in Wuhan in April-May this year, it was a similar message. What I see with China is that it's actually seeking, where possible, to de-escalate its relationships with other normally critical partners around the world. That should include, of course, Australia. Our challenge always as Australia is to pursue a balanced strategy with China. We're allies of the United States. As I've always said to our Chinese friends, it ain't going to change. We are a liberal democracy. China is not. That ain't going to change. However, we have major economic stakes in each other in terms of the trade and investment relationship. That should grow. And on our global collaboration on questions like climate change, that should grow as well. That's what I call a balanced relationship. That's what this Australian government should be pursuing, rather than flip, flop, flap.
Just finally, how critical is the relationship between the two leaders here? Donald Trump on the one hand and Xi Jinping on the other. It's a relationship that sort of waxed and waned, and now they're going to be facing off at the upcoming G20 summit. Well,
Stan, it's going to be a fascinating meeting because there's nobody in Washington right now prepared to make any prediction as to how this G20 summit meeting between Xi Jinping and President Trump is going to go. Nobody knows which way Trump is going to jump on whether or not there should be a deal on trade or the beginning of a process to resolve the trade war. So therefore, all the balls are literally up in the air. If you add, therefore, Vice President Pence's engagement with Xi Jinping in Port Moresby at the APEC summit just recently, and the crossing of swords at the APEC meeting between the Chinese and American sides, metaphorically that is, then frankly it's looking a bit rocky as we head towards the G20 meeting. But Trump loves to surprise. He believes that's his ace in the deck. And so nobody that I know is prepared to predict whether this will be a further deterioration in the trade war and slapping on of further tariffs, or whether he will seek to buy the peace. There are too many arguments running in both directions on this, and nobody who knows Washington well is prepared to make a punt at this stage.
Kevin Rudd, again, thank you so much for your time.
Thanks for having me on the program.